Hello, I'm Jake Stone,
I'm Jesse Owens.
and we welcome you to another episode of Generally Particular, a production of the London Lyceum. Generally Particular is a show dedicated to discussing and reflecting on the whole Baptist story. We are a show by Baptist, about Baptist, and for Baptist, as well as Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterian, Lutherans, and yes, the Mennonites, and even if there are some Hutterites out there. I'm a Calvinistic Baptist. Jesse is an Arminian Baptist. In the 17th and 18th centuries, we were known as Particular Baptist and General Baptist. So we've brought those together to form what we think is a fun show called Generally Particular. Today's episode will be airing on the week of July the 4th. And so as we celebrate American independence, we are going to discuss religious liberty. And so our episode is entitled Let Freedom Ring. And we want to talk about someone in Baptist history that's maybe not as well known, but is very important in the formation of the Baptist distinctive regarding religious liberty, and that is John Murton. Jesse, when you hear Let Freedom Ring, what comes to your mind?
Oh, it's easy. Martina McBride.
Martina McBride, fireworks, hot dogs, remembering that, in the words of Ron Swanson, history began on July 4th, 1776. Everything before that was a mistake, except where it deals with Baptist history. Because one could say that the Baptist, even of the 17th century, exhibited the spirit of America. Now that'll preach. That will preach. So
I
we
don't want
think
to ask you. I don't want to ask if you've actually preached that, but we'll just let it go.
I think that there has been at some point back in my past.
Yeah, I
I
see. I can see a tent revival somewhere in July.
I probably said, "I love America." I'm sure those words came out of my mouth at some point in a sermon. And you know what? I do love
That's okay.
America.
That's okay. Yeah, that's okay.
So let's think about this. We want to kind of set up, first of all, this is not the be all to end all episode on religious liberty. We would like to do a few of these, kind of focusing on some different men in the Baptist tradition that helped kind of give us this really robust understanding of religious liberty. If somebody wants to use the terminology of separation of church and state, tolerance, and so forth. And so, most people, when they think about Baptists in this issue, Roger Williams is kind of who comes to their mind first. And of course, people debate, should we even call Roger Williams a Baptist or not, and so forth. But we want to talk about someone today, Jesse, that, you know, you and I have discussed this before, that is someone that had a profound impact on Roger Williams and how he formulates religious liberty, and that is this man named John Murton. So, who is John Murton?
Yeah, I think you're right. John Murton is an essential part of our discussion about early Baptist views on religious liberty. And I don't think we can should have an in-depth conversation about Roger Williams's view on religious toleration and religious liberty without some reference to Merton. And maybe we can talk more about that in a little bit. But John Murton was involved with the separatist congregation of John Smith and Thomas Helwys around 1608. And he's involved in that congregation. Of course, eventually, Helwys and Smith go their separate ways over doctrinal issues, some of them ecclesiological, some of them more Christological even. And Merton sides with Helwys, with the Helwys congregation. He's a part of the Helwys congregation. And then he ministers with Helwys for some time. And then it seems that when Helwys passes off this scene sometime in the 16 teens, maybe, that he dies in prison, that Merton then is Helwys's successor for the Baptist congregation there in Spitalfields. And he writes some important works on religious toleration that are very influential, I think, for early Baptist arguments on toleration. And I think he's influenced by Helwys in some ways, but I think he writes with greater clarity and specificity maybe than Helwys does at times. And then, as I was saying earlier, which we can talk about in more detail, then it's very clear that Roger Williams, in his Bloody Tenet of Persecution, published in the 1640s, in some dialogue even with John Cotton, that he has read Murton. That seems to be very clear. But yeah, John Murton, thinking about him pastoring in the 16 teens, 20s, and important General Baptist leader, important advocate for religious toleration.
So let's talk about the works that are attributed to Merton. What is the most significant things that he penned, and you can kind of share a little bit about the why do you think maybe how he wrote on the subject he's more precise than Helwys?
Um, yeah, so if you read some of Helwys's arguments for religious toleration, it probably bears. It's probably worth repeating here that I do think in Helwys's defense of religious toleration, what he's making first and foremost is an ecclesiological argument. And that is something that we've said on this show. But if we want to think about Baptist political thought, especially among the early Baptists, thinking specifically about Helwys and Murton and Williams, and even someone like Samuel Richardson, who's a signer of the First London Confession, um, it is an ecclesiological argument. So they're not. It's not like they're some sort of proto-Lockean figures who were more than half a century before, three-quarters of a century before John Locke, making Lockean arguments for religious toleration. They're making arguments from the Bible, and they are ecclesiological arguments. I know we've said that in this show multiple other times, but I think it's worth repeating again that they're making ecclesiological arguments. And you see that very clearly in Helwys. You see it in Murton as well. He does make ecclesiological arguments, but he makes some other types of arguments too. I think what makes Murton clearer is his writing style is a little different, and I think it's easier to read. But Helwys's arguments in Mystery of Iniquity are they're very kind of eschatological. He does a lot with the book of Revelation and with Daniel and things like that, and it gets very caught up in types and things like that. And I think some of those things make it a little bit more difficult just to read. But so I think that's part of it. Two of the works that I wanted to discuss today, though, are Merton's objections answered by way of dialogue, and then another work, A Most Humble Supplication. Those are sort of shortened versions of those titles that are a little bit longer. And I will say there is another work that Brackney attributes to Merton on religious toleration. And there has also been some debate in the past on on the two works we're talking about. One of them in particular, I think it's Objections Answered by Way of Dialogue, on whether or not that might have actually been written by Thomas Helwys. But it seems like it was written by John Murton. But maybe those are some things worth pointing out. But first and foremost, Merton is still writing very much in the vein of Helwys. He makes very similar arguments to Helwys. And I think if you were to read Helwys and Merton, and then you're to read Roger Williams, or quite frankly, if you were to read Samuel Richardson, and sometimes Samuel Richardson even more, they're using the same arguments. In fact, I was reading a work by Samuel Richardson recently where he uses almost the exact same arguments on multiple occasions. In fact, there are a couple of places where he says a couple of things almost verbatim to what you find in Helwys or Merton. And I don't know if he's picking I'm not exactly sure where he's picking those up, if he's just read them. But I think the title of the Richardson work is The Necessity of Toleration in Matters of Religion. I think it's from 1647. But yeah, Merton makes his own contribution, but he's obviously indebted to Helwys in a lot of ways. I just find Merton a little bit easier to read.
We should also share with our audience the fascinating story that Roger Williams reports about the second work that's attributed to Murton, the A Most Humble Supplication, that it is said, all right, quote, that the way that the book was gotten out was that it was written in milk on sheets of paper, and they were
Yeah.
this Williams says the stopples of his milk bottle. Such writing remained invisible until held before a flame by friendly hands. So it's kind of got that national treasure vibe to it. Um,
Yeah.
you know, I,
So that's about most humble supplication.
yeah, and I thought about
Yeah.
that. I recently was uh, given the privilege of seeing the actual uh, book here at Southern that the professors signed when they joined the faculty, and there was almost that urge in me to want to, use some lemon juice on that thing to see what Baptist secrets might be contained to go find. So,
Yeah. That might have cost you your job in the
it
library.
could have. I also had somebody
Um,
ask me, did I go ahead and sign the book? And
yeah. The world will never know because you did it in milk.
yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so by the way, that Merton work is actually it's like 37 pages, printed pages. So if he wrote that in milk, that's pretty impressive.
It is.
That's also at the end of that work, and I think it's 1621. He signs that work, or what you find at the end of that work is it's not attributed to just him. This is something I was reading recently in an essay by Stephen Holmes, which is really interesting. That in the Helwys and Merton church in Spitalfields, sometimes Helwys and Merton would write things and they would make a note that they were the author of the work. And then other times they actually seem to attribute it to the entirety of the congregation, and not just of confessions, but sometimes individual works like this. But anyways, he is at the very end of this one, the king's majesty, loyal subjects in all lawful obedience, unjustly called Anabaptists.
Mm.
So there he is in 1621, trying to make it clear that he's not like those Munzer Anabaptists. So
Yeah. Well,
can
let
I add can
go
I
ahead.
add one other thing
Yeah,
really quick
yeah.
while we're at it? While I'm thinking about Samuel Richardson, and I'm thinking about um, Merton and the way in which Roger Williams cites John Murton, and he actually republishes sections of Merton's work. In fact, there's a section where Williams quotes a bunch of historical figures in defense of toleration, and there's some of the same figures that Merton quotes in his work when he's in A Most Humble Supplication. But to go to show you that Helwys and Merton are influential in the decades following, and I think even beyond that, because of the way in which Merton's work is brought into Roger Williams's work. Um, Samuel Richardson references Williams's Bloody Tenant. So he had at least read portions of Merton, and I think Williams imbibed some of Merton's arguments in Bloody Tenant. But Samuel Richardson actually cites the Bloody Tenant in his work. So here you have a connection between Helwys and Merton, and then Merton's work making its way into Williams's work. Richardson clearly having read Roger Williams, and then obviously some of the material from Merton, and then that's influential on this particular Baptist and a signer of the First London Confession. So there is a sense in which I think sometimes people think that the arguments of Helwys and Merton are kind of lost to history, but that doesn't seem to be the case because, again, Merton's work in particular finds its way into Roger Williams, and then Roger Williams is widely read, clearly in England, thinking about Richardson, but certainly in the American context by figures like Leland and Bacchus and others. So there's a sense in which through Williams, I think many of the arguments that you find in Helwys and Merton kind of live on, even though their names aren't always recognized.
Yeah, and I think what that shows in many ways it's interesting is it shows the organic connections that are taking place and that there's kind of a link you're seeing through time where these men are either directly or indirectly citing and showing who's influencing them. I think, too, it's interesting to think about, particularly with some of the, uh, shall we say, recent propositions on Baptist origins, that it shows at least, I mean, Roger Williams and Samuel Richardson would fall at the end of the Calvinistic end of the spectrum theologically in Baptist life, and yet they're familiar and citing that which is coming from the general Baptist, the Arminian side in Baptist theological groups, so that there's, sometimes it's kind of presented as if those two groups had, really nothing to do with each other, that there's no kind of overlap. I'm not saying they all went and had coffee together at that point, but you can see that they're
They weren't they
familiar.
weren't hitting up Hanover at that time.
No, that's not till later.
Okay.
You are seeing that there's, they're receiving it. I think it's some of this also. It's an older journal article, but if someone's library has access to it, it's well worth their going and looking at this. But it's from Timothy George, and I think we've cited it before. Now he wrote it for the Mennonite Quarterly Review, but before that scares people, it's a really good article on English Baptist and religious toleration. He wrote this in 1984 when he was on faculty at Southern, and he talks about, and I know that people have certain images that come to their mind when they hear the phrase middle way. They'll start thinking, oh, that's some kind of moderate squishiness. But I think Dr. George, he uses that phrase. It's very well put that the early English Baptists were really seeking a middle course between the Anabaptist pacifism, even anarchy with some of them, and then the Reformed magisterium. And they're really looking at this we would say biblically ecclesiological middle way. And Dr. George says this on the heading entitled Two Kingdoms. The Baptists claim that religious persecution resulted from the confusion of the temporal and spiritual realms. In the former, as we have seen, the king's authority is unquestioned. I think it is important to point out, I mean, it's not like Thomas Helwys, for example, is advocating for Jeffersonian democracy. That's not
Yeah.
that's not happening in his writings. But in the latter, the government has no prerogatives at all in the spiritual realm. Here, Christ is king alone. This doctrine of the two kingdoms implied the basic incompetence of the magistrate in all purely spiritual matters. The attempt of the king to establish by law a particular religion and to prohibit by force the exercise of any other religion were clear violations of Christ's royal prerogative. The king may indeed be a member of the church without giving up the use of the sword. Of course, that's countering what the Anabaptists had written. But he
Right.
must refrain from imposing his civil authority onto the spiritual realm. And then this is a really great line. Thus, the Baptists recognize the possibility of a Christian magistrate while denying with equal vigor the concept of a Christian magistracy. So I think that really shows where they were landing. And as we've already pointed out, this is not some novel concept flowing out of the Enlightenment. A lot of times, these basic tenets of Baptist religious liberty are put in the Enlightenment, or now the most famous phrase that I see used all the time, but nobody can really give a real definition, is this post-war consensus, as if that somehow defines what it means to be a Baptist. I don't, and that's in reference to World War II, that, Baptists fighting for religious liberty didn't show up till 1945. Well, my goodness, we're talking about 1612. We're talking about
Yeah.
nearly 350 years before. And so I think what we just described, yeah, I think you can go through when we're talking about the Baptist tradition, we're talking about something that's very diverse and has a lot of components and layers. But what I just read as a summary of what you're getting from these early men, I think every Baptist historically would affirm all of that. That's where they landed. So nuances aside on some things, this is the heartbeat of what we have thought with religious liberty. And really, I think it's fascinating. This is one of the things I love about Baptist history is that there are sometimes the men that aren't as known contribute things that really do make a huge difference and a huge impact. I mean, Carey, for example, is the name, but Robert Hall Sr.'s work, the help to those traveling to Zion, was the evangelical Calvinism that Carey was yearning to see if that could exist. Now, Robert Hall Sr. is way lesser known among those men, and yet his work, he was better than his son. We won't go down that road, but senior was better than junior, and so anyway. So my point is, John Murton is not a name. I mean, we know very little about his life, but his contribution to the literature is absorbed by Roger Williams, and that's the person that makes the biggest impact in a sense.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think you're also right to say that happens. That happens oftentimes, and so there are always these figures that are lesser known. And I think if people do know the name Helwys, they might not know the name Merton, and so raising awareness of that, I think, is important. And then certainly thinking about those direct connections with the influence of Merton on Roger Williams, and then, as we mentioned earlier, then that going to Samuel Richardson and others. And then in the American context, people like Backus and Leland and others reading Williams is significant. And so John Murton plays a big role in that for sure.
And I would say and this may get me in trouble with some people, and that's okay. But I really feel like the men like Backus really distill what's being communicated by those like Helwys and Merton and Williams. And what I mean by that is that I think by the point of men of Backus' generation, there's a maturity more in Baptist life theologically of how to argue for these things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So, and I think it's interesting. Look, there's no, and even Dr. George talks about, and look, we're not trying to sit here and say everybody thought in Baptist life the same exact way. He talks about when you get into the 1640s and 50s, when you do have the English Civil War, the regicide of Charles I, for some people a day of mourning, still to this day. And but let me just say though, let me just say I was listening on a side note. If you want a good political podcast, National Review's The Editors is a really good podcast to listen to. And one of the guys they have on there is originally from Britain, but he now lives here in America as an American citizen. And he talked about revolutions and coups that usually they don't go very well. Usually what comes after is worse than what they were seeking to replace, but there are exceptions. He said the American Revolution, and to some extent, he said the English Civil War, a little bit, but the Glorious Revolution. And I think that, there was a lot of changes going on. We've talked about this, me and you, a lot. It's hard for us in our context of 2023 America to appreciate. I mean, a man like William Kiffin, for example, who actually lived a long life, all of the changes that happened in his life, politically, socially, culturally. He saw the English monarch in James and Charles I was absolute monarchy in many ways, divine right, all of that. And by the end of his life, you've had William and Mary come to the throne and really a constitutional monarchy being established. So there's no doubt the Baptists in England were really having to try to find their footing with so much going on. But that's why I think when you get into the American context, the colonies, the late 18th century, you're seeing more and more this identity coming to a maturity. And I think that's
Yeah.
a reason why, by that point, their contemporaries in many ways in Britain, uh, Fuller, John Ripon, they were supporting the colonists against the crown.
Well, I think you're right to point out that with all good history, context matters. And so the this situation in which Helwys and Merton are writing in is not the same context that folks in the 1650s are writing in, And so when you think about the period with Charles I, the time with Charles I, and then you think about some of the way in which Baptists praise Cromwell, um, well, that has a lot to do with the period in which they live. Of course, even Baptists during the time of Cromwell, and you can see this in Samuel Richardson, they're still favored disestablishment. So, for whatever high and lofty thoughts that they have of Oliver Cromwell, like Richardson still opposes the institution of the tithe for the supportment of an established church. So he thinks Cromwell's great, and he's thankful that it's Cromwell and not Charles I. But it still doesn't mean he's for established religion or an established church, certainly, at least not the support of an established church through the implementation of a tithe. And certainly that, like you said earlier, that's not the same scenario in which people find themselves in 1660 in the Restoration, which is not the same scenario that Keach, let's say, finds himself in later with the Glorious Revolution in the late 1680s and early 1690s. These are different situations, and certainly in the American context too. So the way that they deal with these things varies based upon their context. But I do think there are some consistent threads, and I would say some even consistent types of arguments that they make. They appeal to certain texts, and it's not just Romans 13 or other passages. There are other very specific texts that they seize on, and certain types of arguments that they make that you can kind of trace throughout, even if the context in which they're writing it and maybe the emphasis falls in a slightly different place in a different age or in a different era.
Well, it's definitely their argumentation is rooted in their understanding of covenant theology. I mean that's one common thread that you find. I mean, that's Roger Williams. That's a huge component of his argumentation. But he's drawing that from
Merton too.
Yeah, Helwys and Merton about that the understanding that the British king is not the Davidic king. They're not the same person. That's not the same role. And then even as you move into the 18th century, I mean, that's the chief deal for Isaac Backus, is his coming to an understanding of how the covenants fit in Scripture. And they're drawing from, Gill, but they're also drawing from John Owen as well by that point. And, it's really in many ways, that's why we consider John Owen a Baptist, because I mean, there's so much of his ecclesiology and federalism that fit. I think he was. He just couldn't get there publicly. He is now.
Yeah.
And
but that's you're right. You're right. That is one of the key arguments.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
is to say that earthly kingdoms should not be conflated with the nation of Israel. You can't conflate those two. In one place, Merton says, kind of for those who would defend the idea that your political theology can be based on sort of the old covenant people of God. He says, he asks, "May it please your majesty to give us leave to ask of your learned in what place of the word of God your charge stands, We often read of your charge in civil things, and that your power is from God. And he hath given you a sword to punish evildoers and to defend the innocent, but not to support any religion, nor suppress any religion by your earthly sword now in the time of Christ. So he realizes the covenantal distinction. And he's saying, you can't use your civil authority in the realm of Christ. And so that is a consistent argument that you see throughout.
Yeah, and I think that this is interesting. From Timothy George's article, he writes, during their first decade in England, the Baptist leaders suffered long and lingering imprisonment for many years in divers counties of England, leaving behind them widows and many small children. Helwys himself was placed in prison some 100 miles from his home, his wife and 7 children forbidden to visit him, his property in Nottinghamshire confiscated. By 1616, Helwys was dead, succeeded in turn by John Murton, who suffered a similar fate 10 years later. Thus, the Baptist view of toleration was born out of the experience of persecution and martyrdom. This in itself did not make the Baptists unique. Oppressed sects had long argued for their right to religious toleration. What set the Baptists apart was the explicit avowal of universal religious toleration, or as Helwys put it, let them be heretics, Turks, Jews, or whatsoever, it appertains not to the earthly power to punish them. And you get some version of that throughout many men. Now, there's times where they have a different view towards Roman Catholics, and I do think it calls us to understand how Catholicism was viewed at that time because of the political machinations of Rome in the courts of Europe. But even you have some, Baptists throughout this time who argued that they should have full rights as well, which is just really, that in itself is radical. I mean, when you think about it, to say that even, the papist should be able to have the full freedom to practice their own religion. And so I just think it's interesting in the life and the work of Merton and how it's carried on, being able to see these threads that are still with us to this day and how we think about, these issues.
Yeah, some of these guys would actually argue for. During that time, there's some discussion about um, allowing Jews to migrate into
Yeah.
England, and some of them defended that,
For
and it
eschatological
wasn't.
reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, and that certainly may be part of it. But there certainly seems to be a sense in which they make an argument also on the basis of conversion. Like they see some of these things as an opportunity to share the gospel with people. So it's not as if they're saying, people should be able to worship as they want and no one should proselytize. They're certainly in favor of proselytizing and missions work and those sorts of things and conversion. But they're just saying it's not the responsibility of the magistrate to compel those things, to coerce those things by the power of the sword or imprisonment or fines or the confiscation of property or any of those sorts of things, which, like you said, Merton and Helwys personally experienced.
Yeah. Anything else that you'd like to add about why should we read John Merton? What should we just really take away from him?
Um, there is a place in Merton where Merton clearly has a very high view of Scripture, and I think it's in Most Humble Supplication. He actually lays out this really clear defense of inspiration,
Mm.
which is it's really really good. But part of the reason he's doing that is because he's going to make a biblical case for religious toleration. And there's actually one place where he says um, that uh, that Protestants in England, and he's thinking about the established church, are worse than Roman Catholics. He says Roman Catholics kept the Bible from people because they didn't want them to read it and they didn't want them to interpret it for themselves. But he's saying we were given the Bible in our own language. But then when we dare interpret it and we come to these conclusions, then we're persecuted for coming to these conclusions. So we've been given the Bible in our language so that we can read it, but we actually can't come to certain interpretations, which is worse than not giving people the Bible at all, which I think is kind of a fascinating point for him to make.
Yeah, and we were talking about it earlier. It's really interesting. Merton is one of the people at the beginning of the classic Russ Bush and Tom Nettles volume, Baptist and the Bible. He is one of the early Baptists that they look at in his defense on the inspiration and inerrancy of the Scripture. So,
yeah, that section and it's near the beginning of A Most Humble Supplication. I was trying to get the page numbers in the version that I have of it, but it's in the first 15 or so pages. I think it's probably in the first 10 pages. His defense of inspiration and illumination is really good, and in some ways, I would say for Baptists, a little ahead of his time. Not in the sense that Baptists didn't share those beliefs, but the way in which he sets them forward in sort of a clear, concise way is unlike anything else I've seen from this period in the early 17th century.
So as we wrap this up, Jesse, as I said at the beginning, this episode will be released the week of July the 4th. Will you be participating in your local hot dog eating contest?
I will not be participating in the local hot dog eating contest. I think there's some sort of July 4th bike riding parade around our neighborhood. So maybe I can get some American flags and tuck them in my hat or something and ride around the neighborhood and set off some fireworks.
I wanted to close with this poem entitled "Our Flag" that was written at the end of World War I. All hail our grand and glorious flag that proudly floats on high. We stand beneath its stars and stripes, and all our foes defy. Our fathers for it bravely fought, those faithful men of yore. Help us, O God, to prize it well and love it more and more. And then this last lines. So we'll rally round Old Glory, the dear emblem of the free, and we bravely will defend it, whether on the land or sea. And I almost started crying there at the end. So
yes, see, look at you and your post-war defense of religious liberty.
What can I say? I'm just one of those types. I'm moderate. All right. Well, we hope everybody enjoys this first kind of look at Baptist and religious liberty. And so until next time, stay Baptist. And if you are an American citizen, be proud to be an American.